On the table in front of you, near the pepper, there is a small container of white crystals that cost you almost nothing. You did not check the price when you bought it. You will not check it when it runs out. For most of recorded history, that would have made no sense at all. The substance inside that container was, for roughly 2,000 years, the most dependable source of government revenue on the planet. Not gold, not land, not grain. Salt. Chinese emperors paid for their wars with it. The kings of France required every subject over the age of 8 to buy a fixed quantity of it each year, by law. The British grew a hedge of thorn trees 1,000 miles long across India to stop people carrying it over a line on a map. None of that was about seasoning. So how did the cheapest thing in your kitchen become the thing that funded empires? And what took the power out of it? Here is a contradiction that ought to collapse under examination, and does not. The oceans hold enough salt to bury every continent. For most of human history, it was still scarce enough that states executed people for moving it without permission. Begin with the body. You cannot manufacture sodium. You lose it constantly in sweat and urine, and you must replace it daily, or your nerves and your blood volume stop working. For most of the human past, this took no thought, because meat, blood, and milk carry sodium with them. Laurent Cordain and his colleagues, working from the chemistry of wild foods, found no evidence that people before farming ever went looking for a salt deposit. Agriculture broke that. Grain and vegetables are low in sodium and high in potassium, which is backwards from what a body needs. The societies that learned to store food were the first that could not feed themselves without a mineral they had to go and fetch. Then there is what salt does to other food. It pulls moisture out of any cell it touches, and microbes cannot live in what is left. That property is the only reason food could cross a winter, an ocean, or a border before refrigeration. Armies, navies, and cities all sit downstream of it. Extracting it is not free. You need either sun and wind in the right proportion, which few coastlines have, or fuel to boil brine, which means forests and somebody to cut them. Universal demand, every day. Supply at a few fixed points. No substitute of any kind. The historian Sam Adshead argued in Salt and Civilization that administering salt is where states first learned to be states. Not everyone accepts that. The obvious objection is that the arrow points the other way. That strong states taxed salt because salt was easy to tax. Hold on to that. It returns. In a meadow in Neams County, in northeastern Romania, there is a mound of ash 60 meters long. It is 8,000 years old, and it is the earliest evidence of an industry anywhere in the world. The place is Poiana Slatinei at Lunca. Olivier Weller and George Dumatroia published it in the journal Antiquity in 2005. A salt spring comes out of the hillside there, and it still runs. Beside it, in layers dated to between roughly 6,000 and 5,500 years before the Common Era, sit dozens of stacked fire pits. That mound is the receipt. Turning brine into salt means boiling the water off, and boiling takes wood. Experiments at the site suggest 420 liters of brine yields about 23 kilograms of salt. The ash is what several thousand years of firewood looks like, once converted into something you can carry. We do not know their names, or whether they ate the salt, traded it, or cured hides with it. What the evidence supports is narrower. Somebody worked out that a spring which tastes wrong can be turned into a solid, and that the solid keeps. By roughly 1,300 years before the Common Era, people in the Austrian Alps were cutting galleries into a mountain at Hallstatt to reach rock salt directly. The salt preserved their picks, their leather, and eventually one of the miners himself, found in the workings in 1734. The graves of that village hold ivory and amber from across the continent. A few hundred people buried like aristocrats because they sat on top of something everyone else had to come and ask for. The pressure that follows has three parts. The first is geography. Salt is not distributed the way demand is. It comes out of specific coastlines, specific springs, specific domes of buried rock, and everyone, everywhere needs it. The map of who needs salt is the map of human settlement. The map of where salt comes from is a scatter of dots. The second is weight. Salt is heavy and cheap, the worst possible combination for land transport. The Via Salaria, the salt road, ran from the pans at the mouth of the Tiber into the Sabine Hills, and Rome cut it because a cargo of salt loses value with every mile it travels over land. Past a certain distance, the journey costs more than the load, which means whoever sits between a source and a population is not merely a merchant. They are a gate. The legions later marched on a road that existed because somebody needed to move salt inland. Across the Sahara, the same logic produced one of the most lopsided exchanges in commercial history. At Tagaza, salt was cut from the desert floor in slabs and carried south to the gold fields on the Niger. Gold came north. The desert had salt and no gold. The savannah had gold and no salt. Geography set the terms, and the caravans obeyed. The third part turns a trade into a system. Demand for salt does not fall when the price rises. A household that cannot afford salt does not stop buying salt. It buys the same amount and stops buying something else. Any ruler who has tried to raise money knows the problem with taxing people directly. A harvest can be hidden, and a household can lie. And land is defended by men with private armies who are also the people you need at court. Salt has none of those defenses. It comes out of a small number of places, in the open, and everyone alive is a customer for life, which produces the thought that organizes the next 2,000 years. You do not tax the people. You stand where the salt comes out of the ground. In the year 119 before the Common Era, in the capital of Han, China, an official named Sang Hongyang was handed exactly that problem. Emperor Wu had spent a generation at war with the Xiongnu, and the treasury was empty. The conventional answer was to raise the land tax, which meant taking money from the great land-holding families, which meant a political fight the throne might not win. The answer Sang Hongyang helped build instead was to nationalize salt and iron. The design is the template, and it is worth looking at closely. The Han state did not set up in the markets and try to catch people avoiding a duty. It went to the point of production, taking over the coastal evaporation pans, the Great Salt Lake in Shaanxi, the brine wells of Sichuan. Producers were licensed and paid a fixed price for their output, and the state sold that output at a price it chose. There was no inspector at the door and no declaration to file. It worked for three reasons, all of them properties of the material rather than of Chinese politics. Consumption could not be reduced, so the revenue was steadier than any harvest tax has ever been. Production could not be concealed, because a salt pan is hectares of shallow water in the open, and a brine well is a hole with a crew around it. And the levy did not feel like a levy. It arrived as a price. A village family paid a larger share of its income to the throne than a landowner did, and never saw a tax collector. That is not a side effect. It is the invention of the regressive consumption tax, and it was engineered on purpose by people who understood exactly what they were building. We know they understood because the argument survives. In 81 before the Common Era, the court convened a formal debate on whether to keep the monopolies, and a scholar named Huan Quan wrote down what was said. The result is the discourses on salt and iron. Officials argued that the state must control the necessities, or the rich will control them instead. Scholars argued that a government selling things to its own subjects at a profit has stopped being a government and become a merchant with an army. 21 centuries later, that is still, almost word for word, an argument people are having. The rest of the world did not read the discourses and did not need to. Where there was contact, the model traveled. Where there was not, the same shape kept reappearing, because the same constraint kept producing it. Venice built a state finance on salt, and Jean-Claude Hocquet's work in the Venetian archives shows how deliberate it was. The Republic paid its shippers a subsidy to bring salt home as ballast, so the salt office would have something to sell. The French crown made the gabelle permanent in the 14th century. The British ran the same play across a subcontinent. Sang Hong Yang was executed in 80 before the Common Era on charges of treason by a rival faction. The machine he assembled outlived him by roughly 2,000 years. In the France of Louis XV, the same weight of salt could cost more than 20 times as much on one side of a provincial boundary as on the other. Hundreds of kilometers of that boundary ran through Maine and Anjou. Here is what the system cost while it was working exactly as designed. In the provinces of the Grand Gabez, every person over the age of 8 was required by law to buy a set quantity of salt each year from a royal warehouse at a price fixed by the private consortium that had leased the tax from the king. Nobles were exempt. Clergy were exempt. Royal officials were exempt. So a line on a map became an industry. Jacques Necker, finance minister to Louis XVI, recorded the returns. In the first years of the 1780s, in the district around Laval and Angers alone, an annual average of 2,342 men, 896 women, and 201 children were convicted of smuggling salt. That is one stretch of one frontier in a country full of them. Among the men in those registers is André Rousseau of Méral. He was arrested in May 1764 at Ballot, outside Craon, with his horse loaded with salt. The fine was 200 livres, which converted, unpaid, into 3 years of forced labor. He was arrested again in May 1769, carrying salt on his back, and gave a false name. In August, the court identified him as a repeat offender and sentenced him to 6 years in the galleys. Rousseau's father was a prosperous weaver. His brothers and sisters had trades and made respectable marriages. He was not starving. He was not desperate. He had done the arithmetic. The gabelle did not manufacture criminals out of hunger. It manufactured them out of a price gap. When a commodity costs 2 livres in one village and 56 in the next, the border stops being a border and becomes a wage, and men with options take it. Sentences ran from flogging through conscription to the galleys, and for some, exile to Canada. France settled part of New France with men convicted of moving salt. Scale that logic up to an empire, and you get the strangest structure the British ever built. To keep cheap salt from the princely states out of the territories where the tax was collected, the inland customs line ran roughly 2,500 miles, from the Punjab down and across to the coast of Odisha. By 1878, more than 1,100 miles of it was a living hedge of babool, prickly pear, and thorn, in places 12 feet high, patrolled at its peak by more than 14,000 men. Roy Moxham reconstructed it from the annual reports of the Inland Customs Department, because on the ground there is almost nothing left to find. An empire planted a wall of thorn trees across a subcontinent to stop a mineral crossing a line. That hedge is the most precise measurement we have of what a state will spend to defend a monopoly on something people cannot stop buying. It was abandoned on the 1st of April, 1879, and not out of mercy. The British had taken the Sambar Salt Lake and could tax at the point of manufacture instead. 2,500 miles of hedge became pointless the moment the Raj learned what Sang Hongyang had known 2,000 years earlier. The system did not end because anyone decided it was unjust. It ended because it stopped being worth defending. And that happened for two reasons about 70 years apart. The first was chemistry. From the 1860s, Ernest Solvay's ammonia-soda process turned salt into an industrial feedstock, the raw material for soda ash and later for chlorine and caustic soda. Factories began consuming it by the shipload, and mines and pans expanded to a scale no ancient monopoly had contemplated. Mechanical refrigeration and canning then removed the other pillar. Salt had been the only technology humans possessed for moving food through time, and now it was one of three. Both monopolies broke within the same half-century, and the price fell towards nothing. The second was Dandi. On the 12th of March, 1930, Gandhi walked out of Sabarmati with 78 companions and headed for the coast. On the 6th of April, he waded into the mud and picked up a lump of natural sea salt, which was illegal. The choice of target was surgical. Every Indian paid the salt tax, and none could claim they did not need salt. The law being broken criminalized picking something up off a beach, which is not a law any government can defend out loud. Those two causes are not independent, and the order matters. By 1930, the salt revenue was no longer the pillar of the Indian budget it had been a century earlier, because industrial chemistry had made salt cheap everywhere. The Raj spent its full moral authority defending a shrinking asset, and lost that authority in public over a handful of wet crystals. States rarely lose their most valuable holdings to protest. They lose the ones that have quietly stopped being valuable and are still guarded out of habit. The Indian salt tax was finally repealed in 1946. What salt left behind is mostly the map. The old European route for it sits inside Salzburg, Hallstatt, Hallein, and Hall. In England, it is the ending of Nantwich, Northwich, Middlewich, and Droitwich, 4 towns that exist because brine came up there and for no other reason. In Rome, the Via Salaria is still a street name. None of these are memorials. They are the fossil record of where the choke points were, and they show that settlement across 2 continents was arranged around a shopping list. The other inheritance is the design. A monopoly on something people must buy, licensed by the state, and collected at the point of production rather than the point of sale, is still how most governments tax tobacco, alcohol, and motor fuel. Sang Hongyang's side of the argument won. What salt still does is stranger. In 1924, in Michigan, iodine was added to table salt to prevent goiter, and the practice spread worldwide because it worked. The exact property that made salt perfect to tax, that everybody buys it and it comes from very few producers, made it the most efficient delivery system for a public health measure ever devised. The choke point did not change, only the hand on it did. And most salt now never goes near a kitchen. In the United States, according to the Geological Survey, road de-icing took around 41% of the salt consumed in 2024, and the chemical industry about 39%. Food processing took 4%. The substance that once decided where human beings could live is now mostly spread on motorways in winter, from which it runs into the rivers. So pick up the container on the table. Last year, bulk salt sold as brine to industry in the United States went for around $10 a ton. Rock salt went for around $56. The cardboard and the plastic in your hand cost more than what is inside them, which is why nobody has ever thought to lock it up. None of that happened because we stopped needing it. Your body has the same requirement it had in Neimt County 8,000 years ago, and the Geological Survey still notes, in the flat language of a government inventory, that no economic substitute for salt exists in most of its uses. What changed is that we learned to make so much of it that the gate disappeared. And every empire standing on that gate found it had been standing on nothing more permanent than a bottleneck. It is the only rock you will eat today. For most of the human past, it was also the price of being governed.